Shalmaila, and this is David Lichtenstein welcoming you to this week's program. And the topic is, how do we view our Gedolim? Through what prism? Are they human? Do they have taivas, yetzaharis, foibles, failures, struggles? Or do we put them on a pedestal and we say they're sort of demigods, they're perfect, infallible, error-free, fabulous. When they were 6 months old, we saw in one of these hagiographies about a certain Godol, he made a bracha when he was nursing from his mother. I know these are a little bit extremes, but what should our prism be? And what's the idea? On one hand, we say, look, when you start taking apart Gedolim, it's dangerous. I've seen that. Let me share with you a story I saw by one of the Balei Musa. He said that there was a physician. A fellow went to law school, and I'm dressing it up to make it more modern. He graduated top of his class at Yale, or Harvard, or Stanford, #1 law schools in the country. He practices law, malpractice medicine for a few years, comes back to his town in Kansas, wants to live the good life, where he grew up. And he's fantastic. And malpractice, he's amazing. He destroys any other lawyer in Kansas. Nobody else there went to Yale. He was top of his class. Makes a fortune in his town. Marries this amazing girl, right? And gets a call in his office. His wife's expecting. She was rushed to the hospital early, childbirth. So he says, okay, I'm on my way. On the way there, they call him in the car. They say, no, she's hemorrhaging badly. She needs a specialist, He says, well, I'll pay anything, $1 million, get any kid, I can afford. And the doctor on the other line, there are no doctors left who are high-risk specialists. He says, why? He says, because you sued them all and they left the state. You killed them with your malpractice. And obviously, the mother and child die. So what is I've heard this from, a Rebbe comes home, a kid comes home from school, and what does his father say? The Rebbe, I remember him from yeshiva. I wasn't. And then the kid, a month later, takes off his yarmulke or stops learning. He says, why? He says, well, the Rebbe is nobody. You told me that, right? So there is a danger to humanizing, our teachers, our mechanchim, our gedolim. The counter-argument to that would be, well, there's a difference between either denigrating, mocking, making litzanis, or pointing out the successes of their struggles, how they overcame and how they triumphed, right? And makes them human, and we could relate to them. And we'll see that this is a disagreement that is among great. In the Shiurei Das from the Telz Rosh Yeshiva, everybody heard of this, it's, Bloch. He writes, and we'll print, of course, we publish it online like all our Maramakamis. He talks about Teiraseinu Teiras Emisi. He's talking about the Avos HaKadoshim. He says, Ba'isa Shah Sha'Torah Mete'eres Lanu is godless Avos V'Kedushasam. When it talks about their greatness, Einoi Eiveres B'Shtika Al Chesreinei Seyem. It does not stay silent about their faults. Einei Chapa Al Magari Seyem. There's no cover up here on their where they lacked. Eina Mete'eres Eisam Kanoshim Elikim Balma B'Chol HaMailas B'Li Megaris V'Chesronis. Doesn't show them as these ideal, doesn't deify them, apotheosize them, show them as these pristine, incredible people. Mufshatim Michal Inyani Kayches V'Chaimer. He says it doesn't do that. He says because if it do that, Ki Lu Haisa Torah, if the Torah would create, what could we possibly learn from them? And he says these great Anshe Maila, Ki Kishehem Nichshalim Lefamim B'Davar Ma, when they fall, Hayediyah Hazois Menachemes Umelamedes Oisam. This Yediyah teaches them Shekacha Hi Tchunas Adam. This is what man is. Because Be'ezem Adrega Shiyamei Adam, I'm reading exact quote, no matter where you are, Ve'ech Shia Godol Hakaras Sebem, how great your understanding is, B'kol Zeh Muchrach Sheyimtzu B'y Koiches Hativiyim Shemoishchem Oisei Lamata. He says when we see their humanity, we say, wow, they were human, they struggled, But look what came of them. Right? When we talk about the Gemara says, from Reb Yosef says, from this one you could learn how a wealthy person could live in learning. From Yosef you learn how a beautiful person who's all the women in the world were chasing after, you could still stay whole. He says, this is the purpose. This is how the Torah teaches us. This is one side of the debate. On the other side, we have his contemporary, the great Mashgiach Rav Dessler, ultimately in Ponevich, where he talks about how, on the contrary, we have any mistake that it says in the Torah, when it says in 2 weeks ago, last week's parsha, it says about by the Mei Meriva, where the Rambam says that Moshe was koyes, or the Sifri says Moshe was. What does it say? Moshe Rabbeinu balach lal kas ubalach lal toyes. Right, it's the Lashon. He says, Shimuna HaMoirim, he says, Gimel Pamim, Moshe balach lal kas ubalach lal toyes. Right, and what does the Rambam write on? And what does the Rambam write? The Ramban writes, Hevel Havolim. He totally disagrees. On the other hand, we have the pasuk in Kol Adas Yisrael Yishku, the Nelam Davar Me'enei Hakol, talks about the carbon Helam Davar, when all of Sanhedrin, the Einei Ha'eda, all of them, the Sanhedrin, and when it talks about the Sanhedrin, we're talking about the greatest people. I heard a story, and if one of our listeners could tell me if I'm hearing it wrong, please do, that when Rameshel Seif Chayev, he needed an operation, and he took a great interest in how it was done. So his son-in-law said, Shver, why are you so? So Ramosha said, because I have to make sure, it was a pacemaker, that it doesn't create a mum. So he said, why are you so concerned about a mum? He says, because when Mashiach comes, he says, I will be on the Bezdin, on the Sanhedrin, and you can't be in the Sanhedrin with a mum. So I want to make sure it's not a mum. He took it for a Dava Pashat. So when we talk about, the pasuk says, "Im kol ha'ed adas Yisrael yeshku v'nelem davra me'enei hakol." Chazal say that's the Sanhedrin. What does it say? They all made a mistake. That means they're not infallible. So we have this struggle back and forth the Torah. So how do we look at our teachers, at our Rabbeim, at our leaders? What should our attitude be? Is there such a thing, infallibility in Yiddishkeit, or is it a Christian belief? Should we try to hide it? Should to expose it? Is it a lack of kavod, or is it a makar for chinuch? Does it diminish the stature of Gedolim, or on the contrary, it elevates them in people's eyes to see how great you could become, notwithstanding the fact that you're made out of a basar v'adam? So these are going to be some of the debates that we're going to discuss. And who do we have on? Well, it's 20 some odd years since the making of a Godol, the book that was by Nosson Kamenetsky, Zechariah Levracha. So we're going to have on, and it's banned. So we're going to have 3 speakers on this topic, 3 guests, and 2 of the 3 knew Reb Nosson very well and knew the Sefer. One of them is from Yerushalayim. We have his brother-in-law, Reb Nosson Kamenetsky's brother-in-law, Reb Chaim Waxman. He'll speak about the impact it had, how he struggled with it, how devastating it was to him personally when they banned the Sefer that took him decades to write. We will have from Lakewood, we try to go again trans-global, Reb Shiman Shimanowitz, a publisher, a very erudite, who has spoken about this topic, about, he knew Reb Nosson Kamenetsky personally. He will speak about how he knew about him, he interviewed him, etc. We will have from New Jersey, Reb David Bashefkin, another erudite speaker, writer. So it should be a very interesting debate. Before we go to this week's guest, I would like to say a word on the Parsha. This week I'm going to talk about Bein HaMitzarim. These are times of grieving, of sadness, of reflection. What does the Chazal say? What was the cause of the last Churban? What's the cause of our current Churban? Is Sinas Chinam, our inability to get along together. Now, there are many relationships that the Torah puts on a pedestal. Kibbut Aveim is an Aseres HaDibros. What does it say? Children and parents. Right? It says, V'heishiv leiv avos albanim. The first thing, when the prophet Eliyahu comes back at the end of time, right? When the Mashiach Meheri Yavai, he says, V'heishiv, he'll fix the relationships between parents and children. But I would argue that the greatest relationship, and therefore the area where there's the greatest destruction, is not parents and children, It's spouse, husband and wife. And what's Mara'i? Mara'i is, what does it say for starters? It say, Ishtay kigufay. It's not even almost a relationship. It becomes, do you know that there's a daya in Hilchos Loshon Horah, whether you can tell Loshon Horah to your wife about somebody? He says, because that's not another person. It's like talking to yourself. When somebody's talking to their spouse, it's like almost like self. It's how you come home. It's not another person, right? I'm not going to go into whether he allows it. I'm just saying that's how strong. Ein adam meis ela leishtay, ein isha meis ela lebayal. Everybody grieves when there's a loss. You know who is inconsolate? Is the spouse. It's a part of them died. And what do we see? We see marriages keep falling apart. So let's go to the most current relationship. And let me see if I can, from this week's Parsha, we could say a vart. So let me share with you a story. You know, religious fighting, this is going on for ages. A few hundred years ago, 250 years ago, in the time of the Goyin, there was a big debate between the Maskilim, the Fraya, and the Fruma. And they came to the Goyin and they said, send a representative to represent Yadus, Haredi Yadus, Fruma Yadus, in a erudite, fashion. So the Goyin said, take Reb Yehuda Leib Maitus of Pinsk. He's a scholar. He's well-spoken, big Talmud Chacham, good debater. So he came to Vilna to meet the Goyin. So the Goyin, they spoke for a while. The Goyin said, are there any questions that you're worried about? And we'll print this story now, Marma. It's a very long story. So he told the Goyin, the person I'm going to be debating with has one of his favorite questions that he says is, he said, Chazal keep messing up. They keep mucking things up. He says, they go way overboard. Why do they have to have all these rules? And I'll give you an example, this guy would say. The Torah calls it a sefer krisus. A divorce is a sefer krisus. Karis is, v'nichrasu means to cut off. It's cut. Why did they have to come and change it to Masechtas Gittin? It's called a get. See how they keep changing things? And that's an example. If they change this, I don't know what to respond. So the Goyin said to him, I'll tell you what to respond. He says, you know why it's called a get? He said, all the oisies in the Aleph Beis, they make words. They make the language. They make the connections without media. What are we? We're nobody, right? Ruach Mamalla. He says, and every letter could connect to every other letter in the Aleph Beis. Aleph and Taf is S. Aleph and Beis is Av. Aleph and Gimel is Agod. He says, there's two letters that never connect. Gimel and Tes. There's no connection in the entire Tanakh of those two letters. By the way, they came from Chaim Kanievsky, and they told him the story, and he said, Ois Zion is also not mitzdaref with Samach or Tzaddik. So, Reb Chaim never misses anything. So the response is, this guy actually, he says, Samach, Tzaddik, and Zion are all made the same way. The tongue and the teeth. Gimel and Tes, not only do they not connect, they have no weight to connect. The Gimel is with the Gorain, and the Tes is with the tongue against the teeth. They're from different parts of the body. So he said, that's why. And by the way, this says there was a Talmud who was listening there. He was the Margolius HaTorah. He said, by the way, this is how it comes to this week's Parsha. He says in Parshas Tamid, this week's Parsha, there's no Gimel and Tes. And he said, according to the Rebbe, he said, the Goyin thing I understand, and I'll give you my explanation in a minute. So that's what the Goyin told him, and it says he went, etc., etc. But here's my question. A very fabulous Torah. The Gimel and Tes don't connect. But this Maskil, if he was here, he would say, well, that's fantastic, but the Torah called it a sefer krisus. Why did you now find two letters that don't connect? Like, so what are you mixing into the pot? And I would be Meisif, and I think the beer on the Goyin is, sefer krisus, a divorce, the splitting, that's the document. When we say Gimel and Tes, Chazal are teaching us the process, how we get to sefer krisus. What leads to divorce? And what leads to divorce? Let me be Meisif something, from a Chacham, from the Heintiger. The biggest relationship expert, marriage relationship in America is considered, and I heard this from many, is a fellow Gottman, the Gottman Institute. I heard he's actually modern Orthodox, Shem Shabbos. And he has a lot of Torah about divorce, and here's something he likes to say. He says, you know the number one thing that couples fight about? You know what it is? Nothing. He says relationships, for the most part, the number one thing it's all about, it's not from disagreement, but from apathy, disinterest, loss of connectivity. You come home and you say, there was an accident on the parkway today, and your spouse says, pass the ketchup, go pick up a remela from Cheder, whatever. No turning towards, really? There was an accident? Did you see it? Was anybody hurt? How far away were you from it? Turn toward, where's the connection? So Chazal taught us something fabulous. You know what get is? Get is there's no connection between these two letters. They don't fight. They have nothing to do with each other. They have no interest in each other. They don't turn towards each other. Listen with interest and take, what did you say? How do I understand it? Making a connection. That is the source of, the number one source of the sinas chinam comes from that apathy. And this Talmud was Moshe something beautiful from the Parsha. He says, what is Talmud about? Talmud means constant devotion, never missing, every single day, twice a day. He said, you know what's missing in that Parsha? Get! The Gimel said, because you can't have in devotion the letters that represent no connectivity. Let me share a thought, continuation of this concept. There was a startling disagreement between Pari and Yosef that I think is overlooked by almost everybody. 7 fat, huge, healthy cows come out of the Agam, right? And then 7 skinny ones come and devour them. 7 really rich, ripe stalks, abundant with grain, come out, swallowed. Okay, dream. There's a word that everybody misses. And you know what it is? It says, Vatavoina el kirbena. When these cows were swallowed, right? V'loinoida kibo el kirbena. It wasn't appearing, they just disappeared. There was nothing left. They swallowed, and there's nothing left. And you know what, Yosef, when he repeats the dream, he doesn't say that part. And here I think there's a big disagreement. A Yosef way to look at something and a Pare. When you have 7 good years, do you devour them? And that's it, they're gone, and now 7 bad years come? And there's no memory? You know what Yosef says? No, that's not what good years are for. Good years are to create memories, to put aside something, because everybody has bad times. But do you have something in the bank account put aside for the bad times? Make granaries, silos, fill them in the 7 years. And when the bad years come, you have so much to take. Did you create memories, relationships, go on vacations, have deep, meaningful conversations, bring up children, host orchim, take care of parents? Did you create memories so that when the bad times come, and inevitably in every relationship there are dry spots. I mean, life is about, even the stock market has ups and downs. But is there an emotional bank account? Pari looked at it, he says, you know what? I won the lottery, I spent the money, I went on vacation, we went to Paris, to London, to France, and we spent all the money. And Yosef says, you know what? That's not the wise way. That's not the Jewish way. No. You put some aside. You reinvest it for the bad times. Pischuli achoisi, my rayasi yoinasi samasi. Yoina flies away. In every relationship, there's time when people need alone time. There are quiet times. That's also part of a relationship. It's another word. I just want to speak one more thought on husband and wife. And I've said this story before, but I think it's a profound and beautiful story. The Sanzarov grew up in Rudnik, right? And the Baruch Tam had a son who was traveling through Galicia. And he came into Davin in Rudnik, and he sees a boy learning Basmada Gedolim, and people coming over to him and asking him questions. And he said, wow, that's very interesting. See this young boy, 15-year-old boy. He goes over to him, he starts talking to him, and he sees this young boy, he's 15, maybe 4. He knows Kala Torah. He talks to Baruch Tam's son, was a Seicha, was a big Talmud. So he writes a letter to his father. His father is a Pirush on the Shulchan Aruch. There's not that many. In all of the thousands of years, since the Shulchan Aruch, there's only a few people made it into the Shulchan Aruch. It's like the absolute crown, right? So you imagine who the Baruch Tam was. He says, I found a boy for our daughter, Rezela, my sister. He's amazing. He's Chassidish. So Baruch Tam trusted his son. He said, tell him to come here, and we'll make a shidduch. We'll make, those days they didn't necessarily meet. What Baruch Tam's son neglected to tell his father in the letter is that the Sanzarav was a cripple. He had one leg that was a gimp leg. It didn't really walk. He dragged it. He needed a stick. But so the boy comes, Baruch Tam, to become an Adim by the Baruch Tam, and he meets the girl. And the girl comes out, and you have to Asul Kaddish Yishad Shirena. They met for a few minutes. She tells her father, listen, I know you told me he's a goyin and it's tzaddik and it is. I don't want a chassan with missing a leg. I'm sorry. I'm embarrassed. I don't want it. She's human, right? So the father, the Baruch Tam, was very humiliated. He goes back. He says, listen to the boy. I know I schlepped you, come from far away. Remember, there was no, the helicopters, trains, planes. But Asul Kaddish, and she doesn't want. So supposedly, this is the story. He said, let me talk to her privately for 5 minutes, and I'll leave without any kapeda. Unusual request, private. So they went into a room. He closed the door. Came out 5 minutes later. Mazel tov, we're engaged. Nobody knew what he said. They say over the Gorlitzer Rav was one of the children. This shidduch created half the Rabbistavis in Galicia, which came from this shidduch. When his mother was older and dying, he asked her, he said, what did he tell you? So he said, he took me over to the mirror, and we looked at a mirror. I was there and he was there. And I looked in the mirror, and he said, it says, Arboim yoim kaidim yitziras havlad. They say, Bas ploini la ploini. She said, I knew that you were going to be my zivug. And look in the mirror. And there she was, and she had a gimp leg, like a wooden leg, one leg dragging. And he had 2 healthy legs. He said, but I knew then, I knew what an Adel and a Shama, what a pristine soul, what a gentle person, and how much it would pain you. So I said to the Rebbeinu Shalom, I said, give her my good leg, and let me have her good leg. He said, and I looked down, and I had 2 good legs, and he had the gimp leg. And I knew that this was my shidduch. So we came out, and we made a l'chaim. And I have a raya to this story from Rashi in Chumash. It says, Noki lebeisai simach es ishtay. So Rashi says he should rejoice es ishtay, which doesn't mean exactly what es ishtay is. So Rashi says, Metargum kolam whoever is metargum v'simach im ishtay, he should rejoice with his wife. Einay elataya is making a mistake. What does that mean? There's 2 ways to look at it. As long as we could rejoice together, I'm fulfilled. Whatever I want, you want. I want to go here, you want to go there. I want this, you want it. I'm making money and you're beautiful. The simach es. So he says there's 2 ways. It's either the simach es ishtay or im ishtay. Ishtay means I rejoice. I make you rejoice. My job is in a relationship. I give as much as I could. I do what I can. Make you happy. Make the children, the wife, the husband. Right? There's another way to look at it. As long as I'm getting my quid pro quo, that's good. I'm not getting my quid pro quo, out of here. I'm not being fulfilled. What does Rashi say? Mandatana v'simach imishtay. It has to only be with you. Quid pro quo. Einay elataya. He's making a mistake. He's saying the Sanzarav was right. Before we go to our program, I want to ask the riddle of the week. Here's a very contemporary riddle. All our friends in Israel will get them hopping. It says, "V'hirashtem es oretz v'yashaftem ba." Right, this week's parsha. So the Ramban, or next week, depending where you are. Kosav Ramban. The Ramban writes, "Mitzvah zu mitzvahs asehi. Yitzava oisam sheyeshvu ba'aretz v'yirshu oisay ki unasna lehem v'layimasu b'nachlas Hashem." The mitzvah of Yeshivas Eretz Yisrael, which many Mefarshim hold. It's not a mitzvah, say. Machlokes Rishonim, right? Here's the question. According to the Ramban, that mitzvahs Yeshivas Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah saseh, which, by the way, if you go to the Misnachlim or in general, many Charedim in Eretz Yisrael, certainly our wonderful Mizrahi friends will tell you this is the mitzvah. Shkula Yeshivas Eretz Yisrael keneged kol mitzvah shebetayr. It is a Loshon Chazal. But here's the question: what does it say inside it? Dorish Reb Samloi. Why did Moshe want to go so badly into Eretz Yisrael that he davened Tfilas, Communion, Veschana, and Tavkov Tesvav Tfilas, right? V'chilechel mipiryahu. You think he was hungry? He wanted the special pomegranates, the grapes from Machne Yehuda. That's what he was missing. But he says, Elakach Amar Moshe. Harbe mitzvahs nitztavu ve'en mekaymenais el Eretz Yisrael. You have trumas, maestras, etc. All the mitzvahs in it. Why doesn't Reb Samloi say the simplest thing? I need mitzvahs? Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Yishakol keneged kol ha'Torah kula. That's why Moshe wanted to go into Eretz Yisrael. So according to these Rishonim, that is a mitzvah, b'etzem ha'yeshiva, what's the kash of the Gemara, Nesava Moshe, and we learn it from this week's Parshat Ramban, says V'rash Demazaretz. That is riddle number 1. Riddle number 2. Lanu shama kol makei nefesh b'shgaga. The mitzvah of to build Ari Miklat to save the Makei Nefesh Bishgaga. The Tosefta, it says, right, we'll print it, Roifei Uman, an expert physician that killed accidentally, right? He made a mistake, he operated and he slipped. These things happen. Or he gave the Chayiv Gullus. Look, we spoke about the malpractice doctor. Lots of malpractice. If he killed somebody, Bishaygeg, was an error. Malpractice doctors sue on mistake, right? What's the halacha? He goes to Gullus. Pella is, what do we say? The Rambam says, the Gemara says, right? A Rav Hamakes Talmidei, or a Shliach Bezdin is supposed to give Malchus, and he's supposed to give 39. On the 30th, the guy died, right? The halacha is Pturin min Gullus. Why Shenemar Lachtov Eitzim, right? It says Wodavar Rishus Hakasav Medaber. But if he wasn't a rishus, it was a mitzvah, there's no gullus. So I ask you, Hatzalah member going to save somebody, a doctor going to save somebody, that's not a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah, of course it's a mitzvah, Hatzol's nefashis, right? Chal Shabbos for it. For many reasons, a doctor is because of Shabbos Haveda, like Samuel, whatever the reasons may be, it's for sure a mitzvah. Hatzol's nefashis. So the Hatzalah member goes, he would be chayiv, if he killed the guy, he's chayiv gullus. Why is that different than a roife that goes as chayiv gullus? Why is that different when we say if somebody's doing a mitzvah like a makkah a shliach bezdin or a rebbe that's makkah, that he's pata? Those are our 2 riddles of the week. We will, of course, the winners of the riddle. We will send this week. We used to send the headlines. Now we're sending the Mishnah Achrona Chele Gimel, the few copies that we have left. Baruch Hashem, it's sold out in Eretz Yisrael and in America. So, but we saved a few copies for the riddles winners. Let's go to our guests. We have on the phone with us from Lakewood, New Jersey, Reb Shiman Shimanovich, who's the publisher for Machon Alei Zayis, and he corresponded together with Reb Nosson Kamenetsky, Zechron Lavracha. He's well aware of both the Sefer, the Bin. Welcome, Reb Shiman.
Shalom Aleichem. Thanks for having me.
So tell us briefly your involvement with Reb Nosson Kamenetsky and your knowledge of this, and then we'll start talking a little bit about some of the svara, the logic, the debate, etc.
Okay. Basically, when the book came out, it was an interesting book, and I was in yeshiva at the time learning at Brisky Yeshiva. A friend of mine bought the book, and I read the book at the time. I found it very informative, very interesting, very intriguing. That was just a short while after we read the book and we discussed it. We were can't say surprised, because we even got advanced tips from someone who was in the know, but there were signs all over Yerushalayim, plastered about the smartut, meaning the shmata of the book, making of a Godol. They even used not such a nice ad. It said making of Gedolim, it said on the sign. And that was basically I actually lived through the story with the ban, but I never had any personal connection to Reb Nosson Kamenetsky. Interesting, I lived in Eretz Yisrael for a couple of years. The last Shabbos that I was in Eretz Yisrael, so we never made early Shabbos. Almost no one in Yerushalayim makes early Shabbos, but we were very tired from packing. And I told my wife, this week we'll go and we'll find somewhere to make early Shabbos. I called a friend. He said that in Mattersdorf there's a minyan that makes early Shabbos. Okay. I go down to Mattersdorf, and my friend tells me, look, take a look. See that man over there? That's Rav Nosson Kamenetsky. So I wanted to get into conversation with him, so I went over to him, and I drew him into conversation. I didn't directly talk about his book, but I spoke about a different publication that I've seen where he was quoted, and he found it interesting that the things that I brought up in the conversation. We ended up standing outside of the shul, schmoozing for a very, very long time. It was the latest I ever came home Friday night, was that Friday night, and he invited me to come over again. I was about to leave to go, moving back to America, but I came back to his house Matzah Shabbos. We spent another few hours schmoozing, and he gave me a copy of his book, Anatomy of a Band. So I got to know him. I think he was a very nice person. I think he liked me, and I liked him. And since then, a couple of times I had the opportunity of emailing him. I had a question about something about his father. I had a question about something else. And most recently, 3 weeks before he was niftar, I was involved in the publication of a sefer for Yeshiva Torah V'das. And being that he was a Talmud, we solicited a shtickle Torah from him for the Kovetz. Might have been the last shtickle Torah that he ever published in his lifetime. And he right away responded. He sent in a shtickle Torah, a beautiful shtickle. And what's interesting is in that, maybe it's be a little neshama for him, in that Kovetz that we printed, it's called Kovetz on the Sifta Migdal Hameya, that Torah V'das published for the 100th year anniversary of the yeshiva. He says an interesting Dvar Torah which connects to something that he mentioned to me when I met with him that Friday night. He told me at the time that he was in the midst of having these conversations with Rabbi Yashiv about his book. And I think it was Rabbi Reichman, who was one of the people who close to Rabbi Yashiv and knows how to read English, who was basically, like, so to say, the prosecutor telling Rabbi Yashiv what's wrong with the book. So one of the criticisms that Rabbi Reichman levied against him was that in the book he makes his father look greater than Rabbi Aaron Kotler. And that's wrong. Why does he make his father look greater than Rabbi Aaron Kotler? This is what it says. This is what Rabbi Reichman said. And I believe that Rav Nosson was there together with the Talmud of Rabbi Aaron, Ephraim Zeraven. Ephraim Zeraven was there with him at the time. So Ephraim Zeraven was there to support Rav Nosson Kamenetsky, if I remember correctly. And at the same time, the Rabbi Reichman was there to bring out the other point of view. So when they said this taina against him, he responded, Rav Nosson Kamenetsky responded, it says that B'nai Sloit, after the stone got destroyed, they saw Einish Boretz, there's nobody left. So they said, no one left, you have no choice, V'nashkes Avinu Yayin. So he stellt sich the Shaila, I mean no one's left. He said, Avram Avinu was probably around. If Lot got saved, don't you think Avram got saved? What was B'nai Sloit thinking? He said, the teretz is, he says, if the Tate is Lot, and the Vetter is Avram, halt man that the Tate is geresser from the Vetter. So he said that he has a right to believe that Rabbi Yankiv was the greatest, and there can't be a time against him that he makes Rabbi Yankiv look greater than Rabbi Aaron. Interesting enough, in this shtickle.
But doesn't every Rebbe believe that every Chassid believe their Rebbe is the biggest?
Yes,
for sure. You can have a Rebbe with 22 Chassidim, and he says his Rebbe is the Godol Adar. So but
he was talking about not just the Rebbe, he was talking about his father. And interesting, in the shtickle Torah that he published, he brings a Chaya Adam. He brings a Chaya Adam, interesting Chaya Adam. Chaya Adam Klal Chav Zayin Siv Gimel. Chaya Adam Paskins Sheyidme Be'enov, that his parents are Gedolim v'nich b'dei Oretz, af shebe'enei shah b'nei Adam einem chashuvim klal, v'zeh iker kibud. As they bring the Chaya Adam. So Rav Nosson Kamenetsky wanted to say pshat that he says that Yehuda, when he told Yosef about Yaakov, he says Yaakov said about Yosef, ach toraf toraf v'lo re'isi ad heina. So the question is, that's not what Yaakov said. Yaakov said v'achiv meis. Yaakov said he died. Yaakov didn't say toraf adheina. So he said the pshat is Yehuda didn't want to believe that Yaakov can make a mistake. So ironically, it's Rav Nosson Kamenetsky speaking, and he said you didn't want to believe that Yaakov can make a mistake. So Yehuda would let himself to understand, just like a Chaya Adam says, a person who has a simple father has to think to himself that his father is the greatest person around. He said, so Yehuda would think that Yaakov couldn't make a mistake. So he verteidigt Yaakov's words, v'achiv meis, this is Nosson Kamenetsky's words, Yehuda shemeyarak sheYaakov soiver sheyev efsharus shetoyref. But Yehuda would not hear anything that Yaakov can make a mistake. And that's the chiv of kibbud of aim.
Besides Rabbi Reichman's issue that he felt his father was as big as Rabbi Aaron, what other issues were there with the Sefer?
So first of all, there were many issues with the Sefer, and before I would not want to say anything negative about Rab Nosson because I liked him, and like I said, I felt that for the extent of our relationship was a good relationship. But I would mention that in the Sefer Oil Moshe, for Moshe Horowitz, he was criticized by somebody for a person criticized in Hayatoch, and he writes, "Divrei Agra tzarich ian." He says, "How can you talk like that about the Gra?" So Moshe Horowitz responds to him. He says, this mahalach of believing in your Rebbe, and even if what he says doesn't make any sense to you, is not the derech of the Gra. The Gra taught us, ein masaponim b'halacha.
Taisa says on the Gemara tzarachi, and I don't understand that.
So he says,
Sounds like Purim. Taisa says on the Gemara tzarachi, right?
Right.
Tema. How could he ask on Rav? If you could ask on Rav Ashi and Abaye and Rava, you can't ask on the Gra. I don't understand this. It doesn't sound Jewish to me.
So he says, Anoichi loikein imodi, sagt Abba Moshe Horowitz. He says, doesn't think the Gra would agree that we have to come up with doichik pshatim to end for what he says. Fakert, we have to go with what way we understand, and that he says, and those who don't believe like that is not the derech of the Gra. That's rak derech menagdeinu. So I think Rav Nosson Kamenetsky would appreciate if we critique his book or we critique of what he did or say what we think about it. So I wouldn't feel that I'm any way pegeya in him. But first of all, look at the book. You look at the cover. If you notice in the cover, there are pictures of some Gedolim over there. Some look very nice, distinguished and bearded, and some of them are clean-shaven, looking more modern. Now, everybody knows that back in the day, not every Godol was born with a long white beard and a rabbinical garb. Everyone knows that. But on the other hand, what do you highlight? What do you put on the cover? And the emes is, I can tell you that as a mice in my family, my Elta Zayda came from a city called Kamorin. Kamurin, that was a city in Slovakia. And there was a Rav in the town. His name was Rabbi Leskowitz. Yep. So there was we had it on the wall in my great grandfather's house. There was a picture of two Prishborger Bachrim who learned in the city of Prishborg. And they looked more modern, which the Prishborger Bachrim did look for that area in Slovakia. They did look a little more modern. My Elta Zayda would tell my grandfather, "You see this Bacher? This was me when I was a Bacher," but he wouldn't say who the other one was. One day, my grandfather's in the house of the Rav of the city of Kamar. His name is Rabbi Shul Lefkowitz. And my grandfather sees the same picture. So my grandfather says, who is this people in the picture? So the Rav's son tells my grandfather, this one is my father. But he wouldn't tell me who the other one was. So the Isha one would not tell someone else that this Rav or this Magid or this Chashav Yid once looked less Chashav, even though it's not a secret. Everyone knows that not everyone was born with a long white beard. But what are you stressing? What are you trying to show people?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
The Gemara says Rabbi Akiva, for 40 years, was an Amoritz, that he hated Talmid Chachamim so much, Merayi Talmid Chachamim, and Eshchenu Chamoy, right? So I ask you a question. Is it Loshon Horah for the Gemara to say that about Rabbi Akiva?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. What is the very good answer? So you don't have to go to the Gemara. What's wrong with the pasuk? Look at Tanakh. Tanakh is full with highlighting negative things about our greatest Ishia Tanakh. The Torah says things in Fakert. We look at the Mefarshim. They downplay what was done, and the Tanakh even highlights it. Doesn't even downplay it. So there's a certain message that the Torah is teaching you, and the Gemara is teaching you. The question is, could we apply it in our own life? And also, it teaches you something. Rabbi Akiva has a lesson in it. What lesson is there in knowing someone's chesroinus in the past? The pasuk says, "Ba'aloitz tzadikim pasuk mishli chavches yud beis. Ba'aloitz tzadikim rabo teferes ubekum rishoyim b'chupas odam," which means, Dr. Ben Yoina, hatzadikim mefarim umechabdim b'nei odam al kol ma'ila toivish and imtzas bem. Tzadikim will always look to praise and to glorify people for anything good about them. V'rishoyim mechapsim mumei b'nei odam v'shki oisam, their mistakes lashpilam. V'af al pisha kvar hiznichu amaysim ahem, even though they already left those actions. So if a people are behaving in a different way today, do you have a right to go back and say what they did back then? L'chari, you don't.
So I'm asking you, the Gemara talks about Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara, the Torah talks about, you want to talk about Lashonis and Chazal. Chazal we're talking about Moshe now, by Mei Meriva. It talks about the Chet of Mei Meriva, right? Why are we talking about the Averis of Moshe Rabbeinu? The Rambam writes, he lost his temper. The Gemara, what does the Chazal say? 3 times.
Ramban says about the Rambam, Hoysev Hevel al Avolim.
Yes,
Ramban says that.
On last week's parsha,
yes.
Kas, Balachlal Toys, Rabbi Lesben, as a Bishloisha Mekaimis Ba Moishalachlal Kas, Ubalachlal Toys. Right, we have the whole.
The question is anything which is divine, anything which is Chazal.
Avram, this is the Ramban. It's not a Chazal. Avram Avinu Chata Chet Godol. Right, when he talks about Shehevi Ishtay at Tzadekis.
He's interpreting the pasuk. He's interpreting the message of the Torah.
But
the question is, can you find me a precedent? Can you find, in order to prove your point, which is a good point, and like I said, your question is a very good question. I can't say I have the answer, but I'll give
you an answer.
Can you? But before you give me an answer, you'll need to find a precedent in Rishonim and Achronim of contemporaries that will talk about.
The Ravid screams on the Rambam. Divrei shtus. So many places.
No, that's a Rischa Deraisa. That's a Rischa Deraisa. He's not telling you a story that you should know. And the Rambam was a young man.
The Seder HaDoros brings about the Rambam. Okay, when he talks about the Rambam, he says the Rambam was a kid at risk. Do you ever see what he writes about the Seder? He writes about. Okay, he writes about the Rambam, that the Rambam was a boy, wasn't interested in learning at all, did terribly in learning, and then his father threw him out of the house. And he went to learn in another city, and over there he became inspired, and when his father saw him, he didn't believe it was him. He talks about how the Rambam was mamish.
So I would tell you 2 things on that.
You're mentioning the Rambam.
I'll tell you 2 things. Good point. I'll tell you 2 things. Number 1, there are a lot of stories like that, but sometimes you start taking the story apart, you'll see it's not the same thing. They're talking about the Rambam. What age was the Rambam when this story was allegedly happened? And the same thing, the Mashal, we have in the most recent generations. Very often, you have people saying stories. This Godol wasn't a Bal Kisher, and he was a Shvacha Bacher, a Shvacha boy. But then you go back, I'll give you an example, someone who's alive and well today, Dave Shemacham of Vishnoisov, Reb Chaim Kanievsky. I once heard from a person who claimed he was an Eid Re'iyah. He said, Reb Chaim Kanievsky, he told me, was a Pasha Tebacha. Nothing special about him. And today, everyone could become a big Tamachach. This is really Nassim Kamenetsky's message. He says, I'm not telling you, I'm telling the making of Gedolim. You could have been a simple person, nothing special, and you could still become something very special. That's officially the inspiration, how this can be inspirational. The point is that, first of all, I don't think it serves to inspire people. I think it serves to help people. You thought the man was so great. Well, he once wasn't so great, and somewhere in your subconscious, you're still seeing the Chisaron today. You'll go back.
Stop there.
Well, I want to address exactly what you're saying with the Rambam. But Reb Chaim Kanievsky is a good example. Said he's a person. I was in his. The person told me it was his classmate. He said, I remember him. He wasn't anything special. Rabbi Tzvi Ratberg from Lakewood showed me a report written by, I think, Rav Naiman, the Shiva Petach Tikva. He describes the Bachar in his yeshiva. It's amazing how he describes each Bachar who later became famous Gedol Yisrael. Some of them are Moshe Shmuel Shapiro. He talks about Moshe Shmuel Shapiro about what an unbelievable Bach he was, and what a lamdan he is, and very much how he ended up being at the end as well. And he mentions Reb Chaim Kanievsky was a young Bacher in the yeshiva at the time. He says this Bach is a Baki b'shas. When was Reb Chaim Kanievsky, this Shvacha Bacher? When was it? The Rambam was so young when he wrote his Svarim. What point, was he 6 years old, your story was? Was he 5 years old? Is that a Tzushtel to talk about Rabbi Aaron when he came to Slobodka as a full-grown man?
We talk about Rabbi Akiva when he was 40, right? We talk about Rish Lakish.
Again, I don't think it's fair to use the Chazal. I don't think it's fair to use Chazal and the Pasuk as a precedent.
The Aderis, if you look at the biography of the Aderis,
yes,
if you look at the biography, they talk about and even in the brief autobiography that the Chassam Sofer writes, he writes about his fakis, how he struggled with Betachin when the city was surrounded and he didn't understand why the Rebbeinu Shalom was not answering him. I mean, you don't think these people had struggles? And do you think that there's anything to be gained?
The question is not if they had struggles or not. There's no question they had struggles or not. And again, I enjoyed the book, and I would even maybe recommend the book to many people.
Here's my question.
But I would say is the question from a Torah standpoint.
Yeah.
What is the Toyeles in mentioning someone once had a chisaron?
I'll answer you what the Tayelis is, because since it says Dalid Meisu Be'itay Shol Nachash, who incidentally none of them do we have anything from, right? But only Dalid, right? Relatively minor figures in history, right? But everybody else, it says Sheva Yipel Tzadik V'Kam. So your average person struggles, your average yeshiva bacha, your average yid struggles through getting to klapped again and again and again. So when he sees somebody and he says, look, this Godol struggled the same thing, and look what became of him. That's tremendously inspirational. The Torah goes at continually. Adam, it talks about the Chatoim of Adam. It talks about the Chatoim of Noach.
There's certain things the Torah says about the greatest people in history that even you would agree is not publishable today about the Gedolim, right?
Don't we say Masa Yagiu Maise LaMaise Avaisa? Isn't that?
Yes, we do. We do.
Don't we learn the Torah to learn from it?
Yes, we do. We do. But the fact is, you have to find if this was ever applied LaMaisa. I was recently involved in the Torah, being that I'm in the publishing business. Somebody published something that had something negative about somebody else, and that person came with a taina. He said, "You can't publish this. It has something negative about me." And I wasn't really an involved party, but I was involved in the subject. And the Dayanim Paskin, you have to take out the negative thing that was written over there. And I went over to one of the Dayanim and I said, "It's a very nice psak, but I think that a psak like that you can't just come from your feelings. Could you back it up? What are you basing it on?" So he showed me a tshuva, which was written, it's a Sefer Zikne Yehuda, or the tshuva written by Rabbi Aryeh, Yehuda Aryeh de Medina, that he says in the tshuva there was a Tshuvas Meram Lublin was published, and in Tshuvas Meram Lublin there was a mention of a certain Reb Osher who did something negative. And in the tshuva, which was Negei L'Maisa, it's discussed what he did wrong. And the children came with a taina. How'd you publish it? It says something negative about our father in it. That's what he came with a taina. And he paskined. You have to retract all the svarim that have this in it, and you have to take out that amud. So you have to come with a psak, not with a precedent in the Tanakh.
Reb Shiman, do you think that Loshon Horah becomes mutter if it's in a sefer? Is that the need in here?
No, but the nidin is...
So what was it in Torah? They wrote Loshon Horah in a sefer. The Mishnah Bur... It
was Loshon Horah, was a psak.
The 17 arurim. So why should it be mutter if it's in a psak? You gave it a fancy name. You gave it a nusach. I speak Loshon Horah and I put it into a psak. Does it have a meaning that such a thing should be mutter?
So why is the mutter L'Shem inspiration? So why would it be mutter? So why would it be mutter L'Shem inspiration?
So I'm asking you, when it talks about how Rish Lakish, right, became inspired, right, and became the bar plukta of Rabbi Yochanan, is this something that Rabbi Lakish himself would say, this is inspirational and fantastic and every child should read it and it'll bring to your Shmayim?
Chazal can make that determination.
So what is the answer? Lanias daiti. Okay, the answer is that if it's inspiring, if that person wouldn't mind, if it's something that's done mitaych Yiras Shamayim and mitaych, ema, as opposed to litzanis, or to create schayk, or to create a mockery or disrespect, that's one thing. But if it's something somebody says it's famous, in all the yeshivas they said Rabbi Chanan wasn't a Baal Kishrin.
I was referring to that before. First of all, someone published a sefer and wrote the Chazon Ish wasn't a Baal Kishrin. And Kanievsky wrote on the side Moitzi Shemra.
It's just silly.
Moitzi Shemra.
I heard this from Shmuel Birnbaum that Rabbi Chanan was not a Baal Kishrin, and Rabbi Chanan wouldn't mind about this because he sees it as an inspiration to every yeshiva bach who's sitting and trying to learn Chardal and says, I can't understand the 2 or 3 pshatim and taisis. So they say, Rabbi Chanan wrote so much on Chardal, and guess what? And he started out not about Kishrin, and you can too. That's very inspirational.
First of all, can I ask you a question? I mean, you might be aware of the fact that being a Baal Kishrin is usually genetic, right? Right. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman had 2 sons that we know of. Rabbi Simcha Wasserman, he was a Baki B'Shas, big Talmid Chacham and a very bright person. And Rav Toli Beinish was known to be an Eloi. Is that likely that Rabbi Chanan was not a Baal Kishrin? Very unlikely.
I'm just telling you. I heard this from his Talmud. I heard it from his Talmud.
But I personally experienced people
who loved him, right, and used it as a way to inspire Bachrim, right? So when somebody says, look at the
Yavitz writes that to tell people. He says even though we sometimes hear stories like Rabbi Kiva that even though he was very pashit and he became a Talmid Chacham, he says ein soimchem ala nes, and a person who's not a big Baal Kishrin should not hope for that. It sometimes also frustrates people. It doesn't just inspire people. It frustrates people. You're telling someone who's really not capable of learning Chardal, and you're telling him he should go and learn Chardal. That's not necessarily a good message, but that's not really our question.
So bottom line is you believe that when we teach our children about Gedolim, we should teach them sort of these hagiographies that when they were little, that when they were 6 months old, they made a bracha when they nursed from their mother. And you think kids are going to look at this and be inspired by it, and say they never struggled, they never had their failures.
You're referring to a story that's published in Talus Adam about Zamla Volozhina.
I'm just telling you all the art scroll books. Even though in Tanakh it's not that way, even though in Bavli, Yerushalmi, Sifra, in every one of these cases, I'll give you an example. Sifri, Taisefta, it's not that way. But Achsher Dara, it's a new Dara. We should not follow the Torah, not follow the Gemara, not follow the Rishonim, and now we should say the Gedolim are perfect. So a struggling person says, well, he's one of the Dalit Shabei Subita Shalachish. That's what you're suggesting.
No, that's not what I'm suggesting. That you're putting words in my mouth. First of all, I would not recommend the hagiographies, and I'm not at all a fan of them. As a matter of fact, I can't even read them. If you want to read history, I would recommend someone to read academic historical books. You read those books, you'll get the true version of history. Whether history is important or not is a matter of debate. Whether it's at all important. We're not talking. There's two genres of writings. One is a genre about history. For history, I would not recommend any of these series that you're talking about. They're not historical. Some of them are ahistorical. Some of them are patently false. Going back to inspiration, I don't believe that in the majority of times you draw inspiration from somebody because he once wasn't good and now he got better. It's not really the way to draw inspiration. The way to draw inspiration is by telling someone good things that somebody did, and then he'll overcome it. You can tell people the facts. We don't believe in infallibility.
Let me read you a Shiloh Chuvas Meral Bach I have in front of me. He's talking about when they talk about Yosef HaTzadik and what happened with him at Eishes Beit Tifera. It's in Siman Kuf Chavav. He says you should not be ein chsarim but he says ein chsarim betzadik. This that it seems he was almost nichshel. The kala Godol mechaver yitzra Godol memedru adraba hu loymaila kiven shalavisaif nitzel mehavera. Right?
Yes.
He says ein kavanas hapasuk leheinu machshavel says haval kavana leheinu shenitzailu v'shakadosh baruch hu hirchik mehamaveri.
Excellent. That's an excellent message to teach the children. But did he give you an example of a Godol 2 days before him that had such a story?
You know what?
Yankov Emden writes about himself. He says, "I had a ma'isa kamat like Yosef HaTzadik, and I was Karli Nes, and I was Nitzel." He wrote about himself.
Right.
But can you show me a precedent of a Godol Yisrael writing that, inspiring other people, telling them about a Yosef HaTzadik in 2 generations before them? I wanted just to make one more point also, to what Nasa Kamenetsky in his Akdama. I haven't seen it in, 15, 16 years or more since the book came out. But in the Akdama, he writes over there that Gama Avosam v'Gam Sinosam Kvar Avoda. He says, how can I talk about these subjects? He himself asks the question. And he says, Gama Avosam v'Gam Sinosam Kvar Avoda. Which basically says, let bygones be bygones. It doesn't hurt anybody anymore to discuss it, which might also be the litmus test to talk about what you're saying. No one gets hurt today when you talk about Rabbi Akiva. No one gets hurt today. No one takes Yosef HaTzadik personally. But if you talk about someone it's his grandfather, like the case I mentioned, the Tuvas Ram Lublin, the grandchildren came, or the children came and complained, that hurts people.
But I disagree with you. In the case in Rome, 2 people had it in Torah. Reuven says Shiman stole from him $100, and he writes the story with Shiman's name. Shiman's kids say, look, it's not nice that you're right, my father stole $100. That's what a din Torah is, right? When you say that Reb Aaron, in his youth, was so-and-so, he almost got gechapt and he was the soyer, that's not saying that means on his derech la'aliyah, that by him was also the chazal of Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'Kam. Let me ask you a question. It says Daled Mesu Be'itay Shel Nachash, right? Relatively unknown people, right? Doesn't say it about Avram, doesn't say it about Yitzchak. One of them is not Yaakov. Moshe, Aaron, Yosef, David, Ravina, Rav Ashi, none of them. It's relatively. So my question is, if Daled Mesu Be'itay Shel Nachash, why aren't these the people who are hanging in the pictures in the sukkah?
Nice points. He's saying because they're not. You can't get. That's not going to teach you anything because you can't apply to yourself. Because
they're not human. Yosef is called tzaddik, right? Yosef HaTzadik, right? Okay. Yosef was not nichshol when he had the Nisayin. Vayana Sachutza, right?
Right.
The same time that Yosef is not nichshol, what does it say? Vayer Yehuda me'alechav, right? Mm-hmm. And he. At least I'll be pashut, even though it says Manda Amar Yehuda Chata and Toya, etc. But he has the story with Tamar, right? with etc., and the Torah puts them side by side. He is not nichshel, he is nichshel. When it comes to Birchas Yaakov, right? Who does he make the melech? Who does he give malchus to? The one who Kinira vayerd me'alachav, not Yosef. And what did the Mefarshim all say? Because the melech has to be a human person. It says, Liboy Levav Kol Yisrael. How could we stolzu to somebody who never had a Yetzer Hara, never had to do tshuva for anything, never was nichshel? So I'm supposed to learn from him. Yehuda, the one that was, so he becomes the melech, Liboy Levav Kol Yisrael, not Yosef, who's Vayanas Hachutza. So the dogma of a melech by Klal Yisrael is by somebody who fakert. He's this oyer, and he's the Fasemis 100 times it calls him the Baal Tshuva, right? That is, and b'makim shebal tshuva, and we have a call ein tzadik gam yachal. So what is the benefit of creating people? What is yeah, I know that, but what is the benefit of creating people who are the Dalit Shemesu B'ita Shel Nachash? I'm trying to understand it as an educator.
So David, let's just clarify what our point of contention is. I think we both agree. Let's look what we agree about. We both agree that hagiographies are false and perhaps not a good idea to read them or write them. Do we agree on that?
But many people don't, by the way.
Okay, but can we agree on that?
Yeah, we agree.
I don't, especially lacking in emes.
But the truth is, but Reb Shiman, I wouldn't agree with that either. I'll tell you what I think. Okay, I'll tell you a different chilik.
I'm talking about things that have misinformation in it, things that are not true.
But these idealistic things. I'll tell you what I think. I think that when we left, there's a moral. The moral says, you can't cook. So the moral says, why can't you cook the carbon pesach? Why did it have to be tzli? Right? Okay. So the moral says, you know what's the difference between tzli and mavushal is? When you cook a piece of meat in a soup, it gives flavor to the whole soup. So it dissipates, it disintegrates, it dissipates. That's how it gives flavor. He says it's pilot. It spits out flavor. Tzli is the exact opposite. The more it roasts, the harder it gets, right? And the drier and the more intense it gets.
Right.
Right? So the moral says, in the beginning of the journey of Klal Yisrael, right? They didn't know anything. It was like a child. You can't take a child and start reading to him, Sidon mitzadecha, Sidon dertzad, and the other tzad. Children can't.
Great point.
So he says when they left, he says on the other hand by Sukkos, he says Kol Yisrael ruya leisha v'sukkah achas. Why? Because that's the end of the journey. They will mature.
Again,
so
you do agree.
Let me just finish my point. No, so I think that those hagiographies do have a makam. When you're talking to your children, you tell them about the incredible, how they were sterling characters.
You're talking about, you're going to the next category. We're talking about hagiographies that are false. I'm talking about things that are not true.
But my point is they have to be modeled when people get older and they start to struggle and they need inspiration on struggle. At that point, we should say, listen, that shiny, shiny, shiny story, the end is shiny, shiny. There was a lot of stumbling till it got shiny.
Okay.
I think even the hagiographies at a certain point have a value.
Again, the books that are giving misinformation and telling people things that are not true,
that's Sam
Sheker. And it also tells, if it's telling you the message which says, the pasuk says, Ein adam ba'aretz yas tov li'echta, and the pasuk says, and these books say that these people were perfect from the day they were born. I also think it's sending the wrong message and perhaps telling people that if you weren't born like that, if you weren't make a bracha on the mama's milch, you can't become a Godol. I think we can both agree on that. The next step is, so what should you publish for chinuch purposes and then for academic or historical value? So for chinuch purposes, my position is that I don't see any great benefit in adding to the stories that Chazal and the Tanakh said and adding it from later generations. I see no precedent for it, and I see no benefit in it. If anything, I think it sometimes will serve to tell people the wrong message. It a little bit brings the people down a notch, which I don't see any benefit from a chinuch point of view. You want to know if I'm interested, I happen to, as a hobby, I'm very interested in history, what I would read the ones who give you the truth and the full truth and the unadulterated truth. That's a different group. That's the job of the academics.
I don't mean that, but the unadulterated truth will have a lot of the chesroinus that you don't want to hear about. You're saying?
I'm sorry. I can't claim that it has a chinuch value. You're saying when a person is mature and can deal with it, it's fine.
Let me tell you, when the Aderis writes about himself, right? he writes that there was a time in his life where he was going through intense difficulty, right? And he mamish was meyayish, he wanted to leave learning, etc. And he writes he was standing in a marketplace in Plunsk someplace, right? And somebody came over to him and he said, Elio, I remember from yeshiva what a masmid you were. How you mamished, you never, and I was, I was so nisayer, I went back and I continued learning, and he said, till today, I don't remember that person, maybe it was Elio Anavi. And, when I read that story, I became so inspired, because I said, so many times I say to myself, like, my head is splitting, I can't do this. And I said, look, people like Taderis, they had tremendous, and you know what? And somehow they re-inspired and they continue. I got a tremendous chizuk.
You read the Taderis' autobiography?
Yeah.
Did you see what he wrote about Rabbi Chanan?
Yeah.
Do you think that has any chinuch value?
That has no, but you know what? There is no purpose in that. What's the purpose of saying something about a Godol that he had dementia? There's no benefit to that. But when somebody says you overcame your struggles, there's something very powerful about that.
But making of a Godol, back to our book, making of a Godol does mention things like that.
You succumbed to your struggles is very different than you overcame your struggles. So you see a difference to that.
But again, so you're taking something like that, which I think Yasher said not to reprint, by the way.
Okay.
And you're showing your inspiration, but you cherry-picked your inspiration, and Baruch Hashem, you have a good midah of doing that. But you agree that the things that he writes negatively about other Gedolei Yisrael, that's something which leaves you with a bad taste in your mouth. So there is no chinuch value. But making of a Godol does do that. Making of a Godol does have stories like that. You mentioned dementia. If I recall correctly, there's a story about dementia there as well.
So listen, if somebody talks about we're just somebody that would be considered Loshon Horah, the fact that it's in a sefer is not mata Loshon Horah. It makes it fakert. It's Loshon Horah now barabim, right?
Right.
But if somebody writes something that the person himself would say, I think that's very inspiring and you should give that over, I think that's absolutely something that there's no issa Loshon Horah, and B, yes, children get it. Adults, forget about children. The child in me, the adults get inspired when they see Sheva Yipol Tzadik come, that he got back up. I'm not the first to fall down, and I'm not the fifth to fall down. And look what became of him.
I would say that for the Sheva Yipol Tzadik come, for that we have the Tanakh and the Gemara to care of it. We don't have to go looking for more stories and digging up more negative things about people's past and publishing them in order to teach people another raya that Sheva Yipol Tzadik come. Rather, go looking around, like Rabbi Yoina says, of that a tzaddik looks for the milos of people, and go looking for the good things that people did and the milos that people have. That's, I think, the question over here.
So Reb Shiman,
and I don't think walking away from making of a Godol makes a person say, wow, if they can do it, I can do it. No.
I read volume 1. It's very laborious to read. And
you read the redacted version or the
original version. I wasn't a spoil from the public, and there were stories in there that are fantastic stories.
Fantastic stories.
When he writes about the Godol from Minsk, when he came to Telz, and how the postman was saying over the shir, was saying over Reb Leizer Telz's Akira.
It's full of great things.
The innkeeper, it's good. So could it be?
It's full of great things. It's full of great things, no question. By the way, you mentioned the Minsk Godol. That's another good example. There's a book, Gedolim in Minsk, where his confidant wrote about him, and there you should have used that as a proof for your point of view. He writes over there that Minsk Godol was very sharp, and people would come to Minsk Godol, and he would sometimes insult them because of his sharpness and his he had a heated personality, and the Minsk Godol said, I have to sit down and learn Musar. And he started learning Musar, but he got distracted because he got caught up with dissecting why the Chavos Avava says it's 13 Malachim, not 12 Malachim. So he said he couldn't get inspired by the Musar. And then people came to him, and again he screamed at them. So the Minsk Godol told his confidant, he said, so I want to do your will. I want to be nice to people. I want to be a Balmidus, but the Torah cooks inside of me, and I'm not able to do that. So that was another, that I got inspired from, by the way. But you do see, again, but it's him talking about himself, even though his confidant is quoting him.
You don't see that people could get inspired by seeing the struggle.
That's not the tone of the book. That's what he claims to do. It's not the tone of the book.
But my point is, you don't see the benefit of seeing how Gedolim, and I'm not talking about, it's very hard for somebody to feel a relationship, a camaraderie with Abaye, Rava, or Yosef HaTzadik, when somebody says so-and-so Rosh Hashiva, so-and-so Rav, struggled with A, B, and C, and look what became of him. Look at the struggle, the failure, till he got who he was. You don't see the benefit of that. You see only the benefit of saying, wow, look how much he knows.
So I'll tell you. I think that the problem with the book is that it falls between the cracks. In other words, if you're writing a hagiography, Shivchei Tzadikim, you're writing a book which goes and just inspires people. And in general, if you want to inspire people, I think a positive message of great things that people can do, and everyone knows that people are not born perfect. Everyone knows people are not born with white beards. I think that's the most important message and the strongest message. For that way, I feel, no, it's not the most inspirational book because it has a bunch of collections of negative things about people. On the other hand, at least it will serve as a good historical record of the Olam HaYeshivas, which to some extent it does do that because he did extensive research and he has unbelievable amounts of information that he put together. But the problem was that he was not an academic and he was not a professional historian. And so in that way, he also made many mistakes.
Give me a story in the book that you say, you know what, for this it should be banned. Give me one.
We never discussed if I think it should be banned. That's not my decision to make.
Okay.
Personally, from the ban, I felt no. It's definitely not one of the worst things that Klal Yisrael did, that it had to be banned so strongly. If it's my personal decision, I of course defer to Godol Yisrael if they thought otherwise. And I would say another lesson that I got from the whole story, the whole saga, and from seeing the anatomy of the ban, is when people jump on the bandwagon and they ban someone and they just speak against him because he's such a terrible guy because the sign in the street against him, you see the pain the person's going through. And he was a Talmud Chacham, and he was perhaps a bit naive, but he was a Erlich Yid.
Think of a story there that got you heckled. He said, how could somebody write this? Can you think of one?
So I would say the most famous one, which got the Eniklach upset, was a story with Rabbi Aaron. It says that Rabbi Aaron wrote a letter to his Kala, and the Rabbi Zalman saw the letter, and Rabbi Zalman said, got upset. He came to the Alter Slabotka, and he told the Alter, he said that, he told the Alter, Hayitochen, you read me this Bacher. So the Alter said, that's the story in the book. Now, people understood from it, the insinuation was that the letter had something, maybe a bit romantic, something inappropriate, which is what got people very upset. They should write that about Rabbi Aaron.
So can we stop for a second? Do you think that by Rabbi Aaron's Sheva Brachas, they made the Brachas? What do we say? Gila Rina, Ditza v'ched, v'ava v'achva v'shalom v'reis. We asked the Rabbeinu Shalom that there should be a hava between this couple, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is it a terrible thing if a bacha writes something, quote unquote,
obviously,
romantic?
If it upset Rabbi Zalman and the Alter Slabotka agreed that it was something negative, so obviously he stepped over some sort of line. That's the insinuation of the story. So you can say whatever you want about Sheva Brachas, but
I'm just saying. Well, maybe he.
I didn't say
something romantic, and they weren't used to romantic, right? But don't you see somebody looking at a story like this and say, "Oh, you see, Rabbi Aaron was also human, and I have a kala, and I'm in love with my kala, and there's nothing wrong with that"?
That's not what Nassim Kamenetsky responded. His response was that he said, people think that over 100 years ago a bacher would write something like that. He said, it didn't even occur to me such a thing. He said, what did I think it said in the book? He said, I thought probably that Rabbi Aaron maybe gave a chabura in yeshiva, and he wrote a letter to Kala saying how people were so impressed, and Rabbi Zalman saw gaiva, and he was upset about it, and on that the Alter said that he was a goyin. I never said he was a tzaddik. He said, I didn't even occur to me that it could have been something romantic. He says, but later, someone who heard from the Rebbetzin herself told him that actually the content of the letter was neither one of the two. It wasn't gaiva and it wasn't romantic. The subject was that Rabbi Aaron recommended a certain Russian book, literature, which was considered forbidden in those times, and that's what got Rabbi Zalman upset. But that's something when you read it.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
But even that, I find that inspiring. I think that the fact that Rabbi Aaron could have recommended literature. There's not a yeshiva bacha today, unless one of the yeshivas that doesn't have high school, right? Who hasn't read something, what you would consider Shakespeare, whatever they read in things, right? And Elamai, and Sigvorn for them are Rabbi Aaron. Don't you find that inspiring?
Well, again, I'm telling you, first of all, it could be inspiring, but it's not the tone of the book. He mentions that, if I remember, he mentioned the Alter Slabotka, no one ever saw him with a Gemara. What is it supposed to mean? Why are you writing that for?
I can't answer that. I could just tell you one thing, that to make out Reb Nosson Kamenetsky like some Kal, a critic of yeshivas.
I didn't say that.
I don't believe
you didn't
that.
hear that from me. You didn't hear that from me.
My point is, in each thing, I don't know what it was, but my point is, the book, maybe he's not a professional writer, but when you go away from the book as a whole, I came away with 100 fantastic stories, very inspirational stories. So could it be that he said nobody thought Alta would have... you could pick Bein Ashuras about everything, right?
Yeah, but the question is the tone of the book. The question is the tone of the book. Is it?
Do you think the tone of the book was a tone of Kalas Reich?
No, I think it was a tone of collecting gossip.
Gossip? Is stories of Gedolim gossip?
Just anecdotes that have been forgotten for good reason, let's just say.
Really? You think that they've forgotten? Has anybody written history of the yeshivas? Many people have written the history of the yeshivas, but there's two groups of writings. Some of them are, like you say, the hagiography, and some of them are the historical record. This one really serves neither purpose 100%. It's not really inspirational, and it's not a perfect historical record because he was not a professional historian, and there are inaccuracies and misinterpretations of history as well. Okay. Reb Shiman, it was an honor to have you on, and we'll never know. Right? But it was...
Okay.
Thank
you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye. We have on the phone with us from Yerushalayim Professor Dr. Chaim Waxman. He's a brother-in-law of Lahavdil ben Chaim ben Chaim, Reb Nosson Kamenetsky, the author of Making of a Godol. He's professor and chair of the Behavioral Science Department at Hadassah College in Yerushalayim. Welcome, Reb Chaim.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
Reb Chaim, could you tell us the story of the ban on the book, The Making of a Godol? You were a brother-in-law intimately involved. Tell us the story.
The story. Well, there are a lot of aspects to the story, but I'll tell you what I saw, what I read, etc. Okay? My brother-in-law, Reb Nosson, worked on this book for many years. He did an incredible amount of research. He was a very unique person. He had he was very interested in hearing as much as he could about whatever subject he was into, and here he started out there writing about Gedolim, as the focus initially on his father, Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky, and spread on to Gedolim. And he did this massive work. It's a gigantic two volumes that are one, because it was supposed to be the first volume of a series of works on Gedolim. And he published it. As I said, he did a tremendous amount of research. He published it. And as he was away, he and my sister-in-law, his wife, his Rebbetzin, Shalamit, they were in the United States when it happened. The book came out, and all of a sudden there was an uproar in the neighborhood, in fact, where they lived. It's right across the street from them. There was a burning of the book, and posters were put out calling for a cherem, and they made his. They really made his life miserable. He had been looking forward to. He had gotten tremendous encouragement for the book, and some people who had read parts of it were very positive about it, and here he got this, worse than slap in the face. And he took it very deeply, because it's in his chevra, he was in his community, his peers. There were those who signed on to this ban of the book. And what was the terrible thing in the book? The terrible thing in the book was that he wrote about Gedolim, and he portrayed Gedolim as they were. One thing about the Kamenetskis, it's a Kamenetsky trait, they tell the truth. And the truth is that Gedolim are human beings, not malachim. And they portrayed it very positively, but yet as human beings. And there were those who were offended by the portrayal of some of the Gedolim as human beings. And they, as I said, they burnt it. They called for a ban on it. They went to Rabbanim, they went to Gedolim, and there were some who signed a thing putting a chayram on it. And it ate him up. It ate Reb Nosson up, really. He had such aggravation from it, you can't imagine. He tried in every which way to meet with those who were calling for the ban, to explain to them what was there. They apparently, I don't know how many of them read English to begin with. The book was published in English. A number of the Gedolim a number of the Rabbanim, I should say, who signed this ban, I am almost positive do not read English, so I don't know how they did sign it, but they did. And he tried to meet with them to explain, but it was to no avail. He came out with a second edition which modified and clarified some of the things that were challenged in the first edition, and that still did not satisfy the opposition.
So let me interrupt you.
Yes.
Give me an example of something that caused such furor. What did he write?
One that I seem to recall, and something with when Reb Aaron Kotler was a chassan with Rabbi Zalman's daughter. That was she was Reb Aaron's Rebbitzin, and that something the letters that he had written, something about the letters that he had written, and something that Rabbi Zalman said. I do not remember exactly what it was. I can't give you the exact points. I wouldn't want to at this point unless I had it in front of me. Okay, but it was something with Rabbi Zalman, and so something that Rabbi Zalman said about Reb Aaron. Okay, that's what I seem to recall.
Was it disrespectful? Was it cynical? Was it mocking?
It was not written disrespectfully. I know knew Reb Nosson. 57 years we were brothers-in-law, and we were close, and I spoke to him, and I know he admired his great admiration for Reb Aaron. He certainly would not be disrespectful, but he said what had happened there, and it was not Rabbi Zalman certainly was not disrespectful of Reb Aaron, and certainly Nosson was not disrespectful, but this is what it was, and he told what it was.
So what was it about? A deist? Do you have any recollection as to what it was?
I would have to check it out. It's a number of years ago.
What switched in the improved edition?
The language used was changed.
So, Reb Chaim, what did it say in the making of a Godol that caused such a virulent reaction?
There was probably the one thing that caused the most reaction. It was a story about, he told about a fellow in the shir who, there was a fellow who interrupted a shir that Rav Aaron was giving with a question. And Rav Aaron was in the middle of the shir, so it was unusual to interrupt the shir with a question. Anyway, he was a red-haired fellow, and Rav Aaron called him a para aduma. Okay. That's not okay. So it's a story that the family took as, or some in the Reb Aharon's family took as an insult to Reb Aharon. And in fact, in the second edition in the quote unquote improved edition of the book, Reb Nosson took out that story. But the truth of the matter is, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I know for a fact that he did not mean to in any way to belittle Reb Aharon. He just told it over as it was. And I know people spoke about Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, for example, and you'll ask anybody, Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, if you ask him a question that he felt he could wipe the floor up with you at the time because he was in the middle of a sugya, and he was in the middle of something, and what he felt was a stupid question, he would tell you, what a stupid question. Now, did that make him any less of a Godol? Did that minimize the respect for him? Anybody who knew his shir knew that that's the way, that was his temperament. And they accepted it, that was part of it. And that's and I think that was the case the way with Reb Aharon. Reb Aharon was, in fact, in another place he mentions, Nosson mentions about Reb Aharon, a story with Rabbi Zalman about that Reb Aharon was a kanoi, and that's the way he reacted, but it was, okay, so he did take it out in the improved edition.
But let me ask you a question. The Ravid,
right, exactly,
has some very flaming on the Rambam.
You just said exactly what I was going to say.
The Ramban writes on the Even Ezra a few flames.
Look at Rishonim, it's unbelievable. The Ravid, exactly. I meant to say it exactly. The Ravid, when the Ravid talks about the Rambam, whoa. You could think, wow, really wipes the floor. Really uses very strong language, much stronger than anything that Reb Aharon ever said. And, of course, the Ravid is the Ravid, and the Rambam is the Rambam, and it doesn't diminish from the godless.
What else? There was supposedly a story that Reb Aharon wrote romantic letters to his Kala.
Okay, yeah, there was something about that Reb Aharon wrote, and again, I had it here. Reb Aharon had written some letters, and something about Rabbi Zalman made a snide comment about Reb Aharon in those terms. Okay, Rabbi Zalman was Reb Aharon's father-in-law. He didn't, and in fact, I think that's out of the. I think that's out of the second edition. I'm not 100% sure. Rabbi Zalman was his father-in-law, and Rabbi Zalman was a Godol. Reb Aharon wrote letters. I could tell you of other Gedolim. I know that they wrote love letters to their Kalas. Mayesh, does that diminish them? Does that make them? In my mind, that he wrote love letters to his Kala to me is a positive thing. Okay, but
in other words, the criticism. So the criticism on that is, because even though we say by Sheva Brachas, Sasayim v'Simcha Chasam Gila Arina Dit Ava v'Yachva.
Right.
In other words, Shalom, it talks about all the different types of Ahava, but I guess between a Chassan and a Kala, it wasn't appropriate. It's only post-Chuppah that it was deemed appropriate.
There's certain things. Clearly, there are emotions that are appropriate before, and there are emotions that are appropriate after. And I don't think that anything that he wrote was inappropriate. but the idea that to say that he wrote them was considered taboo, because it was considered diminishing the godless. To my mind, as I said, I really don't understand. I'll tell you a story about somebody had called me, a fellow a doctor, a big doctor, prominent doctor in California, had called me when he heard of the ban. And he says he felt so terrible. And he says, listen, I'm about tshuva. And I get strength from finding out that Gedolim are human beings and that they have they behave like human beings, and if they're superhuman, I could never match up to them. I could so I have no model to work towards. And he felt very terrible about the ban. And I wrote it to Nussin at the time. And I said, I don't understand these people who are criticizing you for portraying Gedolim as human beings. You're not portraying them with any negativity.
So let's go to the other side. So yes. What do they believe? That the Gedolim are not human beings? Like, what's the other side of the argument?
Well, let's put it this way. There's the famous... Kol ha'omer sheDavid HaMelech chata it's a mistake. There are those who you look at throughout history. You look at through Tanakh. You look at Chachmei Talmud. You look at Rishonim. There are those who will portray them as malachim.
But here's the question, Reb Chaim. The Chazal say on Moshe. I mean, the Rambam, we just had it. The Mei Meriva,
right.
That he's Bola Klal Kas, Bola Klal Toyes, right?
Right.
Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, B'shloisha Mekayimos Ba Moshe L'Klal Kas U'Ba L'Klal Toyes.
Nachon.
Right.
Look.
We have looked at the biggest. You have the Sanhedrin Gedolah. Right, if they bring a toyes, what does it say? If im kol adas Yisrael yishku, v'nelam dava me'enei akol, so they bring a carbon. What does it say?
Nasi
right? You're right. Yeah, Nasi Yechta.
What can I tell you? You're asking me when I have.
So what do they believe? It goes back to Avraham Avinu. Amar Abavo, Amar Abelezeb. Neiman Nenash Avraham Avinu v'nishtabdu banav. They shenasa and Gariel of Talmidei Chachamim. He didn't treat Talmidei Chachamim well. Shmuel Lamed Nei Shehifriz Al Midaisav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Rab Nasser Aimer Shehifriz Bnei Adam B'Likanis Taras Kan. All talks about the Ramban when he talks about Avram. He says Chet Chata Godol Chata Avram Avinu.
Right. Exactly.
So what do they believe? What's the other side of this argument? Because my job is to always play devil's advocate. What do they believe? Here's the Loshon Ramban. V'dak ki Avram Avinu chata chet gadol b'shgaga.
Right. Okay. They believe. I don't know how they're going to that. Okay, but they believe that the Gedolim are simply on a totally different level than we are. That we cannot understand them. And therefore, we cannot judge them. And I don't think it's a matter of, in Nussin's case, it certainly wasn't a matter of judging. But
when the Ramban writes that Avram Avinu is exact lashon chata chet gadol b'shgaga, what's he saying?
So how often have you heard that Ramban repeated?
I can thought.
Okay, look.
Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amarav. Ilmalo lekibel David Loshon Horah lenechleka malchus bibeis David. V'leyavdu Yisrael avodah zara v'loy galinu me'artzeinu, because of the Kabbalah's Loshon Horah of David. Chazal don't hide this; they don't consider it Loshon Horah. V'taneh Sarah v'tivrach bipaneh. What does Chazal say? Chata imenu be'inoi zeh. Gam Avram chata b'hanichul l'aseiskain. Here's the Sefer Chassidim.
Right. So, but that's what. So Chazal.
Here's the Loshon Horah Sefer Chassidim.
They can use it. They can refer to it because they're trying to teach a lesson to us. But someone who's writing a history cannot refer to those things because that's in a totally different context, and therefore you cannot mention it. Let me give you a different example. Leave aside Gedolim and their humanity. Okay? No, it is, but it's different hashkafas. Okay. One of the criticisms was, one of the major criticisms was that it might encourage secular studies. Reading the book, Nassim's book, would encourage secular studies. Why? There's not a place in there you can go through the book and it's I don't know how many pages, but it's a lot of pages. It'll take you a while to go through it, but there's not one place in there that you will find in any way that Nassim spoke positively or encourage secular studies, or certainly not in yeshivas or anything of the sort. But what? He does mention in several places that his father, Reb Yaakov, was familiar with modern Hebrew, Russian literature, history, and a number of prominent philosophers. He mentions that he knew of Plato, he knew some of Plato's philosophies, Aristotle, and Immanuel Kant.
Well, the Rambam was the biggest bhakti in Aristotle.
Again, you don't have to convince me, but to those who view that as treif, to say that Reb Yaakov knew. Now, I know it for a fact because I heard Reb Yaakov, a story from Reb Yaakov, him telling me himself when he was in yeshiva, he was reading a history book. And he told me a story about it. I won't go into the story, but he told me beferish that he was reading a history book. Now, I'm not talking Jewish history, okay? Reb Yaakov was very interested in history. So, but tell this, there's a certain brand of yeshiva hashkafa that holds that all secular studies are treif, and therefore it cannot be that a Godol studied it. Now, the Rambam, that was a different story. The Rambam was...
Well, the Shulchan Aruch says on Shabbos it's problematic. Right,
yeah,
but
okay.
Sefer Milchama, I think it's in Shin Zion, but it doesn't say it during the week anywhere.
Okay. Again, to me, you don't have to convince me, but you're asking me how they see it, and their guy is that anything beyond, it's Chachma Yavonis, and all secular studies are...
Is history Chachma Yavanis? Like, don't we have to know our place in the world and how imperiled we are and who our enemies are and who they're not? I mean, isn't every Jew have to know history just for our survival, to know history?
Absolutely. I agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that it goes beyond history. Okay, I happen to think that it's part of the kifshuha, the mitzvah of kifshuha, science, to learn about the world, and science. All of that is part of the mitzvah of kifshuha. I heard this from Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, and I've heard it from others, and that's the way I view it. But there are others who look at it very differently, and they are the ones who were behind, in part behind. Once it became an issue, they were behind the ban. Okay, I think the initial thing that triggered it was the interpretation of some in the family of Rav Aaron Kotler who viewed what Nosson wrote about Rav Aaron as disparaging to Rav Aaron, which I know for a fact that he was mechabed. He kept talking about how his father and Rav Aaron were friends and were close, but they took it that way, and once that started, then it blew up into an issue. And even when he took it out in the second issue, the improved edition, it didn't help.
And who drove the band? Do you know?
I have ideas. Yes, it was. Okay, I don't want to get into names.
Did they ever ask him mechila for
and in fact, at his Levaya, the first hesped, I believe it was, and I have it all. I have it up on. I can send you a link to to the hespedim. The first hesped was, to me, was so important, so wonderful, because of what he said there, that those who caused him all that agmas nefesh, who were critical of him, they have to ask mechila. But they didn't.
Yeah.
No.
Reb Chaim, thank you very much. It's the parsha of Pinchas.
Yep.
So the Mefarshim say he nicely as Brissi Shalom, right?
Right.
So I saw in some of the Achronim, why does Pinchas get Brissi Shalom?
Shalom, right.
So I saw some of the Mefarshim said because, a kanoi is not supposed to be an angry person.
Exactly.
Somebody who has anger issues. A kanoi is supposed to be somebody who is deeply touched, like Vayit Hashem, etc. And I think that when we look at people who've done this, I think the question is, are these angry people, or are these generally benign people who really, were nifka by something that was done, cover that fire, etc. You know what I mean?
This is Pashas Pinchas, but they are not. They're not Pinchas. What can I tell you? Yeah.
Reb Chaim, thank you very much for your time.
Take care.
Bye. We have on the phone with us from New York, Reb David Bashefkin. He's the head of Chinuch at NCSY. He's a Rebbe in Yeshiva University. He's a writer from Mishpacha. Probably most of you know him from that. He's the author of many svarim, including a book recently out called Synagogue, Dealing with Sin in Yiddishkeit. Welcome, Reb David.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, Reb David, this week's discussion is the concept of the infallibility of Gedolim, of our leaders. Good, bad, is there a Messiah on it? What's historically, how have Jews looked at it? Give us some thoughts on this matter.
So it's a touchy subject for many, because we're talking about the people who we look up to and who we aspire to become, and there's no question that the Gemara in Moed Katan says that you look for a Rav Doma Lamalach. You should be Yivak Torah Mipihu. You should seek Torah from a Rav, from a leader, from a role model who's Doma Lamalach. But actually, one of the questions I deal with and talk about in the book is that it almost seems contradictory, because we have so many places where the Gemara in Shabbos, says that Lo Nitla Torah L'Malachim. We don't give Torah to Malachim. So there's a contradiction of sorts about the role of being pristine, pure, free from all mistakes, infallibility. On the one hand, we have this Gemara, which is quoted often, that you should have a Rav Doma L'Malach. And on the other hand, we have Gemaras left and right talking about that the Torah wasn't given to Malachim. We have a Torah that has Lo Sachmod and all sorts of others. It was given to people with taivas and with Yetzer Hara. Does that apply to our leaders? And I think that the Gemara, and I heard this from Revolta also, the Gemara that's talking about a Rav Doma L'Malach isn't necessarily talking about a rabbi who is as pristine, pure, perfect as an angel. but it's talking about malach like miloshon shlichus, like somebody who's given a task. You want a role model who is loyal to their talmidim. But having a Rav who's infallible is it's not something, I don't think that's necessarily an ideal, because it doesn't exist. And if somebody presents themselves to you as saying, I am perfect and infallible in every way, they're either lying or they're a malach who shouldn't be presenting Torah anyways. The people who we want to hear Torah from are people who are human and have all of the difficulties of human experience. That's what makes Torah so great and so valuable.
But you have this tension between looking at the Rebbe like a malach, on the other hand, talking about the mistakes they make. And certainly, many people, can't deal with that. You talk about chinuch, when you talk about the imperfections, etc., of rabbeim, of leaders, a lot of people can deal with that. And we know that when you speak to kids about, your Rebbe made a mistake, it undermines the chinuch. You're a mechanech. How do you deal with that?
I would make two very important distinctions. First, I would make a distinction in the type of mistakes and issues that we deal with. I think you need to make a major distinction between issues of leaders performing acts of actual outright abuse, whether it's sexual abuse or any sort of power, literal abuse. That needs to be spoken about, but in a very careful way and not in a classroom necessarily where we're talking about Ma'aseh Tzadikim. Let's put that in one category. In another category, we have the stories of our tzaddikim that are meant to inspire. And in that category, there's been a debate throughout Jewish history about the role of mistakes that Rabbanim make. What role should they play in the way that we teach our children? On the one hand, you have people like Rav Schwab, who wrote very eloquently about the history that we give over to our Talmidim should be pristine and aspirational, inspirational. There's no reason to tell them every mistake and miscalculation and difficulty that our role models have had. But not everybody agreed with Rav Schwab. Most notably, Rav Hutner. Rav Hutner writes in a very famous letter in his Igros Ksavim, number 128, that he laments the fact that in the biographies of the Chafetz Chaim, it doesn't talk about how much the Chafetz Chaim must have struggled with Loshon Horah. And in the biographies of our Talmidei Chachamim, we don't talk about how they have struggled to get where they are. And this plays out a lot in publishing. I think that I find a lot of the memoirs of Gedolim to be extraordinarily moving because it shows their humanity. There was a little bit of a debate over the memoirs of the Aderes, the father-in-law of Rav Kook. And in that memoir, he talks about how he struggled and was so embarrassed over jobs and shtelers that he wasn't able to get. He talks very openly about Chashuv Rabbanim who he felt wronged him. And I look at that, and I'm actually inspired because it shows you that the emotion and struggling with disappointment and failure and all of the day-to-day things, not getting a promotion, which we never think of our rabbeim in those terms, to me that's so inspiring to hear somebody write about that in their own life, in their own pen, is very moving. I hear both sides, and I think there needs to be a balance. I don't put my kids to sleep every night telling them about every mistake that the Chafetz Chaim and the Aderes and the Rabbanim make. That's not what I do. I tell them stories of inspiration, but I mix in there the humanity of the Gedolim because I think Zu hi shvachim shel Talmidei Chachamim. I think showing their humanity, and despite the normal human experience that everybody has, they were able to achieve what they were able to achieve, is the ultimate shevach. It reminds me in a way of the Gemaras in Yuma and in Sanhedrin, where the Nevi'im stopped praising HaKadosh Baruch Hu, calling him a Gibor and a Godol. They stopped praising them because they said, well, we don't see the greatness here. We don't see the greatness here. because it wasn't explicit, it wasn't pristine. The Beis Hamikdash, the miracles that they were used to, everything was gone, and they looked around and they said, we don't see greatness over here. And the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah were Machzer Ateres Yoshna. What did they do? They said, the fact that Klal Yisrael is here, despite all of their failures, despite all the people who are trying to tear them down.
Right?
Exactly.
Hein hang Durosav, hein hang Vurosav.
Hein Vurosav, hein Norosav. That is how I look at the human stories of Gedolim, at the people and the struggles behind all of the svarim and personalities and svaras and darkei halimud that we have, all of those role models. There were very human paths that need to be charted to get to where they were. And those paths are filled with mistakes and failures and difficulties. And I look at that and I say, hein norosav. That makes them more awesome, more astounding, more inspiring.
But you would agree that many don't agree with this Mahalach. I mean, Rav Dessler writes, I believe it's Rav Dessler writes very strongly when, you talk about, Avram Avinu, the Ramban writes, Chotach et Godol, he writes, no, you can't chas v'shalom really mean that it means a ched. It means lefi his madrega and emuna. He had a shadow of a doubt, like a kechut hasaira, and that's called a ched. I mean, you see that consistently among a certain genre of svarim. Would you agree that what you're suggesting is controversial and far from agreed upon?
I would agree that what I am saying is not necessarily agreed upon. As I mentioned, Rabbi Schwab doesn't agree with it, but I would make a distinction between the way we give over Gedolim stories and the way we approach and learn Chumash. And I think there's a very important distinction to be made here, and I'll call out an article that was written. It's an academic article, but it's history, and it's a brilliant article written by my dear friend, Dr. Zev Ellis, where he talks about the history of applying these psychobabble, psychoanalytic terminology to Gedolim, not to the Gedolim, to biblical characters, to the stories of the Torah, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And we definitely have examples of people who took, modern, Freudian concepts and applied it to the Avos. And to me, I do find that problematic. I don't find it problematic to talk about the Avos being sinned. Rav Hirsch talks about it. The Ramban ascribes Chatoyim to the Gedolim, to the Avos, and to members of Tanakh that aren't explicit in there. But I would caution that when it comes to applying contemporary readings of, psychoanalytic terminology onto the personalities of Tanakh, that can be dangerous. And the danger to me isn't that you are diminishing the personalities in Tanakh. I think that the greater danger, and this is something that I remember reading from Shalom Karmi, Rabbi Shalom Karmi, who's a Rebbe in Yeshiva University and writes very widely, the real danger is diminishing your own self-conception. Somebody who's willing to apply these very neat, psychological terms to explain away all the actions of the Gedolim, to me, is diminishing their own sense of self and their own understandings of the complexities of human life and human emotion. And to go ahead and take Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, or the personalities of Tanakh, and neatly put them into some, psychological category, cognitive dissonance, some Freudian complex, to me that diminishes the human condition. It's not always so neat. It's not always so explainable. So where one can add complexity to the lives of the personalities in Tanakh, I would caution people not to diminish them, because that could be a reflection very often of an overly simplistic view of your own lives and your own motivations.
Reb David, give us a few examples of where you see those who are opposed to this Mahalach. I mentioned Rav Dessler, it's in Chelik Aleph of Michtav Eliyahu. But you see already by the Chassidim, etc., the concept of saying something against the tzaddik, you know what I mean? Everything they do is like, give us a few examples.
So when they publish the memoirs of the Aderet, there's a article in a book, I believe, by Emmanuel Etkes, who's a scholar in Israel. The book is called HaGedolim, which talks about the lives of the Gedolim who shaped life in the last 100 years in Eretz Yisrael and in America. And in this article, he talks about the battle over the writings of the Aderes, because in the memoirs of the Aderes, he does talk about and says things about Gedolim that you wouldn't want to hear somebody. He calls out very chashuv rabbanim. And in later printings of the memoirs of the Aderes, they took out some of this. A similar issue happened in printings of Rav Yaakov Emden's memoirs in Megillah Sefer. Rav Yaakov Emden was very candid in self-disclosing some of his struggles, things that I don't even feel comfortable saying on our podcast. You could pick it up and read it for yourself. There were people who openly said that the whole thing must be a forgery. There's no way that a Rav would write that about themselves. But I think the example on the other side from the Hasidic world is Rebbe Nachman. Rebbe Nachman's Chai Maharan, which was written, I believe, by his Talmud, Rebbe Nassan, has a whole chapter on Rebbe Nachman's struggles. And I think part of the oddity, complexity, sweetness of Breslov Hasidus and why so many people find it so relevant was because Rebbe Nachman was so comfortable writing about his struggles in Chai Maharan, about times where he felt bereft of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He couldn't find HaKadosh Baruch Hu in his life. He had trouble davening. All of these things Rebbe Nachman felt comfortable writing about. There's a third category that I'm not mentioning, which isn't, censorship by people who, taking it out. A lot of times Talmidim didn't feel comfortable with their own Rebbe's writings. Rav Kook had Talmidim who were careful to take out certain things in his writings that they felt the general audience wouldn't be able to handle. Rav Tzadok's writings were censored in a way because there are things in his writings that are very easily misunderstood. It's not autobiographical. They're not stories. Rav Tzadok didn't really write a lot of autobiography. He just has his sefer called Divrei Chalomos, where he writes about his dreams. But interestingly enough there, the one autobiographical piece of information is Reb Tzadok says the shorish of my neshama came from the Dor HaMabul. It came from a broken generation. That's where I feel most connected. So I think that there were Rabbanim who felt on both sides of this, and there were many Rabbanim who felt that there was an opportunity and it was important to connect specifically through your failures with your Talmidim and show them your humanity. And there were others, and certainly there are publishers who feel very strongly about this, that there's no reason for it. And I hear both sides, and I mix it up with my students and with my children. I'll tell them stories from both. I don't need to add in all of the complexity to diminish the greatness of our Gedolim. I'll kind of say over ideas a little bit more pristinely, but there are other times that I'll deliberately add in layers of the story that add to the richness and complexity of the human experience.
Now, the Chazon in the Kavitz Igris, it's Reish Test 209, also speaks very strongly against taking the Torah literally when it talks about bowing down to Lilim or Psalim. He says Yichas v'Shalom can't understand it. Kiragulai. He says if you believe that, it would be Batla HaTorah Mitzuya B'Yadenu. V'chal Echad Yivde Bamal Atzmai. He's very against taking these parts of the Torah where it talks about, the Pishoim or the mistakes of either Klal Yisrael or the Gedolim literally. So we see clearly that what you're suggesting is not accepted by, certainly, I said Rav Dessler, the Chazon Ish. I honestly, I haven't done an intense research. Is that so? Is there really a machlekes whether you can or cannot speak ill of Klal Yisrael or the Gedolim in any way? I don't mean as Loshon Horah, but have such a tfisa?
I would make two distinctions. I don't know that I would put the Chazon Ish in that camp. I would want to read the letter more carefully. I believe in that letter, the Chazon Ish is more concerned, number one, about personalities in Tanakh, and number two, he's really almost acting like a proper historian, saying you can't superimpose the way we look at idolatry now and superimpose that on what the personalities in Tanakh were doing. I mean, we have a Gemara in Sanhedrin, I believe, that talks about, Menashe coming to the Tana in a dream. I think it was a Tana Amora in a dream, saying, who made fun of him and saying, if you knew what it was like to live in my time and what the Yetzer Hara of Avodah Zarah looked like, again, going back to that story of the Anshe Knesset Godol, who Mavato that Yetzer Hara, you would be running after it yourself. So I think the Chazon Ish is cautioning something else, but I definitely do think there is, I don't know that I would call it a machlokes. I would call it that there are different emphases. I think there are people who emphasize the importance of a pristine look at our role models, and there are people who emphasize looking at our role models as human beings, and I think that they're both true. I think when you raise young children, it is natural for children to look at their parents as these superhuman, perfect, infallible beings that you can't imagine what your parents were like as teenagers, as 20-year-olds, as 30-year-olds. And as you grow up, you begin to see that your parents, may have had financial troubles. Your parents very likely had marital difficulties, like any other couple. They probably fought, when you didn't see it, and, they had strife and difficulties. You can only learn to appreciate that as you get older, but there's a way to learn about your own parents in a way that learning about their struggles in whatever aspect actually gives you more respect to your parents and more respect for the human experience rather than less. But I think there's an element of maturity in the way you learn and the way you find out, and I would apply the same to our Gedolim.
Now, Reb David, do you think it's ironic that Rav Wolbe signed on the ban of Rav Nosson Kamenetsky Zichron Livracha Sefer, the making of a Godol, which talks about how one particular Rosh Hashiva wrote a love letter to his Kala, and he signed on a ban against it, etc. Do you find that consonant with the position that you quoted from Rav Wolbe about Malachim?
No, I don't. I'll tell you something else. I heard directly from Rav Beryl Gershenfeld, who's a Rebbe in the Kiruv movement in Eretz Yisrael. He runs Machon Yaakov and Machon Shlomo. Rav Wolbe struggled with his own children and had a child who I think struggled for a very long time. I don't know what happened with their own Yiddishkeit. And he said that Rav Wolbe told him once that it was important for him to have a child struggle with Yiddishkeit. So when parents come to him and talk about their own children, he's not judgmental of them. And I think that part of that story is about learning the complexities of religious life and learning about that achieving, spiritual and religious success in life is not a clearly paved road. I think the story of Rav Nosson Kamenetsky, and I only know, I was lucky. I went to Yeshiva Shalavim, where the mashgiach of Yeshiva Shalavim was Rav Ari Waxman, the nephew of Rav Nosson Kamenetsky. So I bought my making of a Godol for 40 shekel. The best investment I ever made. I'd be a multi-millionaire if I bought up all the copies. But I read Making of a Godol, and I loved it. I think it's a very hard to read. And I read, he wrote something after called Making of the Ban, where he talks about how the ban happened. I don't look at the Gedolim who signed on to that. I think it tells you more about the process of how we ban things than whether or not the Gedolim actually thought the book was inappropriate. As you know, the book was written in English. A lot of these people, I don't know if Rav Wolbe read English. He very likely did. But I think that I look at that story as much more of a lament, a sadness about the collective process, political process. I think there were a lot of politics at play on how people are oftentimes condemned. But overall, the book Making of a Godol, if you can get through it, and it's almost impossible to get through. If it wasn't banned, it would not have sold more than 10 copies. It's very hard to read. It's just a biography of the first 20-something years of Rav Yaakov's life, and then, 2,000 pages of footnotes. But the book is astounding. It's inspiring. It's funny. My Rabbeim from Merayi are quoted a few times, or Tzvi is quoted in footnotes. I don't look at that as the Gedolim who disapproved of Making of a Godol, because I find it difficult to believe that they read through the whole thing.
Okay. Any closing thoughts?
I think that the way that we approach Gedolim should reflect the way we approach our own life. And that if you want a life that is filled with complexity and nuance and sophistication, that's the way that you should approach our role models. That's the type of teachers you should seek out. And that's the way you should learn Chumash with complexity. And that diminishing anybody, to me, is a reflection on somebody who has a superficiality in their own life. But being too pristine and neat about everybody who surrounds in your life, whether it's your Rebbe or teacher or parent, may lose some of the opportunity of appreciating and enjoying the unbelievable chizuk that you can get from life's complexities and the inspiration that we learn from life's failures.
Rav David, it's always an honor to have you on. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. Take it easy. Be well.
Bye-bye.